Hundreds of missing person cases pop out every year, but missing person cases that, involve UFOs or some sort of extraterrestrial being abducting their victims are kind of strange. And the story I'm about to tell you today is no different. So the long didn't read version of this story is that you have this young pilot who, took off to this island to go pick up some friends in a rented aircraft known as the Cessna 182. But while in mid-air, he contacted the flight service attendant at Melbourne, which is Australia, because he was, near that area, and then reported seeing an aircraft orbiting around him that had this metallic surface, like a shiny metallic surface and a green light. But he couldn't really identify the aircraft and wasn't even sure whether it was an aircraft or not. After trying to describe whatever aircraft was following him to, the air traffic control, his transmission was instantly, interrupted by this metallic scraping noise. Kind of this unidentified aircraft came so close to him that he started rubbing against his aircraft. And then suddenly, his radio just went, silent, and all contact was lost. Until today, he had never been found nor the aircraft. But there have been some, conspiracies and then many theories concerning this story. And so that's what we are going to look at today. But before we get into this story, if you like this kind of spooky, scary documentary style videos, please consider subscribing because I'll be uploading every week. And so if that's of interest to you, please subscribe and also hit the like button. Now without further ado, let's get straight into the video. On June 9, 1958, Guido and Alberta Valentich gave birth to this, lovely little boy whom they named, Frederick Valentich. Now there isn't much about Frederick Valentich's, childhood on the internet, but from the little on the internet, he was very close to his parents and kind of helped them, and overall he was a good kid, and so his parents loved him and he was loved by them too. Valentich was really thrilled about this idea of becoming a pilot. In fact, that was his dream job, and not just a pilot but a commercial pilot, so that he could fly people around the world anywhere they were going. And luckily enough, his parents, which was Guido and Alberta Valentich, were really supportive of him becoming a pilot. And so immediately after high school, he took a job, but the job is not really known publicly, but he worked a job and then enrolled part-time in flight school. Although Valentich worked so hard for his flight exams and made sure he didn't miss class, he failed all his exams. Despite his determination and passion to for flying, he failed all his commercial exams subjects, and not even once but twice. But that didn't discourage him because he wanted to become a commercial pilot so bad, and so he ultimately enlisted in the Royal Australian Air Force, but that also didn't work out and he got rejected because he didn't have the right qualification. But he still schooled part-time because he was very passionate about flying. But that will all change when he called the Air Flight Service. So on Friday, October 20th, 1978, Valentich told his girlfriend, who was this beautiful young lady called Rhonda Rustin, that he had an evening flight the next day to pick up some crayfish from King Island, which is like an island close to where they were living. At this point, the two had been dating for about 5 months, and so they ultimately decided to have a little 5 months anniversary celebration on the next day, which was Saturday, when Valentich returned home after picking the crayfish. And so the next day, that was the morning of October 21st, Valentich, after getting up from bed, did his normal, morning routine and then took his bag and headed to work. After he closed from work, which was around 12 noon, he attended classes at, Maribyrnong Airport, which was not that far from his workplace. And after 5 p.m., his classes were over, so he decided to, rush and go pick up the crayfish from King Island, which he discussed with, his girlfriend. And as soon as lectures were over, Valentich submitted his flight plans. Flight plans is like this document that outlines the details of the flight's intended path and other important details to make sure that everything is safe, like you have a safe navigation. And he went to rent a flight which was this lightweight single engine aircraft named Cessna 182L. Now remember, Valentich had license for flying private. He had about 150 total hour of flying time, and he had a class 4 instrument rating, which is like a license which authorized him to fly at night in a good condition. But he didn't have the license to fly commercial, which is like he didn't have the license to fly as a commercial pilot, and that was what he was working towards. And so flying this airplane would actually add up to his flying time, which will increase his chances of getting a license to fly commercial. And so shortly after submitting his flight plans, luckily he was granted permission. So he flew his plane and then contacted the flight service officer on duty that evening, which was Steve Robbie. And Steve Robbie would say he was cleared for takeoff. And so at exactly 6:19 p.m. he took off and then headed southeastward for King Island to pick up the crayfish he said he was going to pick up. Whilst he was in mid-air, he radioed back to Robbie, who was the flight service officer on duty that night. He radioed him at 7 p.m. when he passed Cape Otway. And according to the flight service officer, who was Robbie, everything seems fine, and Valentich was on schedule. Once Valentich passed Cape Otway, the route took him over the base straight towards King Island. And so he was supposed to report back to Robbie once he landed. The night was clear and the weather conditions were perfect for flying, so everything was going on smoothly. However, everything would change only a minute later. At exactly 7:06, while Valentich was still flying, he noticed an aircraft flying near him, and so he quickly contacted the flight service officer, and he said hey, is there any known traffic below 5,000 feet? And then Robbie would say no, there is no known traffic around your area. And then Valentich went on to describe this aircraft that was around him. He said it had 4 lights and this aircraft was going unusually fast. And then he asked Robbie if it was an Air Force or something, but Robbie checked the radar and he couldn't see any aircraft near Valentich. And so Valentich went on to describe this aircraft again. The aircraft, according to him, was illuminated by this 4 bright land lights and had this kind of slight greenish glow, and was made of a shiny metallic looking material, like it had a shiny surface and had a long shape. And so he was describing this strange aircraft to Robbie on the radio. He became kind of nervous but wasn't scared because maybe he thought it could be the Air Force. But Robbie was still not seeing any data there. There was literally no aircraft near Valentich. And while he was still trying to describe this mysterious aircraft, the mysterious aircraft started charging towards him at full speed from the east, and then when he was near him, he started hovering on top of his aircraft, like around 1,000 feet above him. At least that was what he. At that point, he quickly realized that no, the aircraft hovering over his aircraft wasn't an aircraft. And then Robbie asked him, then what is it? Because if it's not an aircraft, then what is hovering over your aircraft? And then you say, cause I still can't see anything in the data. But just a few seconds later, Valentich started having engine problems, and then he would tell Robbie, hey, my engine is rough idling, which simply means his engine is having problems. And so as Robbie was about to reply to what he said, like trying to communicate and see the way out, his transmission just went silent for about 17 seconds, and then he was interrupted by this unidentified noise, which Robbie described as metallic scraping noise. And then suddenly there was silence, and then he lost contact with him at 7:12 p.m. And so suddenly Robbie became terrified and just didn't know what to do. He just didn't know what to make of this citation. But he tried to calm himself down, hoping that as soon as Valentich landed on King Island Airport, he would get in contact with him back. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. He waited for the radio and just kept staring at the clock, kind of waiting for 7:28, which was the estimated time that Valentich was supposed to, land. But unfortunately, he never reported back and he wasn't able to get into contact with him. So immediately after 7:28 p.m., he contacted the King Island airport to inform them about what had happened in the last 20 minutes and also the sudden, loss of contact with Valentich, hoping that, maybe he had landed safely. But King Island Airport said no, there hadn't been any land of the aircraft, which was Cessna 182, in the airport. And so immediately a search was launched to find Frederick Valentich. At 8 p.m., which was about just 30 minutes before he went missing, airplanes from King Island immediately started searching the area and around the island where Valentich went missing. They were flying about 1,000 feet, which was enough to spot the wreckage if there was even any. And also the weather was clear. Despite it being in the evening, the weather was very clear. And the pilots, could see Cape Artway in the distance, but they found nothing resembling Valentich, plane. While all this was going on, his parents back in, Melbourne weren't aware that their son had gone missing until, several hours later when the police officers appeared at their door and then informed them that their son, unfortunately got missing and they are still searching for him. And so the next day, the search continued, and this time it was, so massive that, the search team deployed 8 ships and then civilian planes and then, 8 civilian aircraft to scout the area where they thought, Valentich plane, had gone missing. But after days of extensive search, it was called off on October 25th. That was about 4 days of searching without, any clue. But investigators, just didn't understand the disappearance and they needed, answers. And so what they did is that they went through his flight log to see if they could, get any clue of what had happened to him or, some sort of answer. They found out that, he had been involved in several accidents, but that didn't really explain, his disappearance. And his training tutor, said Valentich was an exceptional student who was willing to learn and improve because of his passion for flying and becoming a commercial pilot, and was even close to getting his commercial pilot license. And so he is not sure his past incidents had anything to do with his disappearance. And so at this point, the Department of Transport, who were responsible for investigating this potential crash and writing official reports, came to a dead end, since there were no evidence that the plane hit the water, and the only explanation was that Valentich disappeared on purpose, leaving his old life behind, and that it wasn't a fatal accident or some sort of crash. He just decided to leave his old life behind and then start a new life somewhere. And to support that claim, the Department of Transport stated some reasons why he might do that, which some include that no passenger was waiting for him at the airport of King Island, meaning Valentich lied in the flight report he submitted. Yeah, he wasn't going to meet friends or pick up any crayfish. Also, there were no crayfish to pick up from the island to the mainland, as he told his girlfriend and family. And so this was the report the department wrote. But Valentich's family weren't that convinced by this discovery, because they couldn't find any reason why Valentich would want to vanish or leave his old life behind. To them, it just didn't make sense, because if he had wanted to disappear, for any reason, he wouldn't have used plane, or he wouldn't have vanished with plane, because it was extremely complicated to hide in aircraft. And so the next theory was that maybe he was truly abducted by a UFO, as he called the reporter on the radio just before his disappearance. But when they looked at his background, his girlfriend, who was Rhonda, told investigators that he had seen several space theme movies lately, such as Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Star Wars and other movies, and so that could be the reason. According to her, Valentich started collecting new clippings about space exploration, but wasn't really obsessed with the topic. And one of his friends gave an account contrary to what his girlfriend said. He said he had discussed aliens with him once, and that was it. Apart from that, none of his friends recalled talking about aliens or UFOs with him ever. But Valentich's father also said something completely opposite to what his friend said. According to his father, his son loved talking about UFOs, especially after he and his mother allegedly saw one earlier in the previous years. And so this just made authorities more confused about this whole situation. But despite their effort to explain the disappearance through Valentich's interest in space, the official reports couldn't make any strong link. They couldn't find anything that could link his situation to whether maybe he had faked his own death by pretending to have abducted, or he was truly abducted. And so for decades, the disappearance of Frederick Valentich was a very popular topic in Australia because of investigators and officers couldn't come up with a real explanation, and there wasn't any evidence of a UFO aircraft near Valentich's flight path. The only explanation they could be able to come up with is that the pilot, which is Valentich, had lost control of his plane due to disorientation and crashed into the water. Another big discovery was made on May 16, 1983. That was about 5 years after Valentich's disappearance, which was about 220 miles from King Island. Investigators found an engine cowl flap, and after the Bureau of Safety investigated this flap, they came out with the conclusion that the engine cowl flap was indeed from a Cessna 182L, and the Valentich aircraft serial number was among those who had this particular kind of engine flap. But again, where it was found, which is Flinders Island, is nowhere close to King Island where he disappeared. And while the subsurface currents could have taken this part far away, it is far-fetched. Flinders Island also had an airport, and they also claimed that a Cessna lost its engine flap during a flight takeoff, and so that was also ruled out as a tangible evidence of discovery. After the incident, ufologists, which is like people who study UFOs, which is unidentified flying objects, also found several important details observed by Valentich. For example, he mentioned seeing a green glow, which they think was truly a UFO. Also, a man named Roy Manifold took a photograph on the day Valentich vanished, and the photograph showed an unknown object flying from the water close to Cape Otway around the path where Valentich was flying. But the photograph was not that clear to really identify the object, and some really believe that the young pilot was actually abducted by aliens, and some also dispute this theory as unlikely. More than 40 years later, the Valentich family never got the answers they needed, and there is still no real evidence of what really happened on that night in October of 1978. And so yeah, that would be it, guys. If you find something in today's video, please comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe if you like this kind of creepy, scary, unsolved mystery types kind of video. Please consider subscribing, and also give the video a thumbs up if you like this video, because I'll be uploading every week. And so if that's of interest to you, please don't forget to subscribe. Until then, see you in the next one.